We are privileged to have with us today Professor Jonathan Spencer, who's the Regius Professor of South Asian Language, Culture and Society, and who's also the Deputy Head of the School of Social and Political Science, the University of Edinburgh. Thank you, Professor Spencer, for agreeing to do this. Professor Spencer has published widely on Sri Lanka, South and Southeast Asia, on politics, war and violence, and more recently on religion and politics. He has been carrying out fieldwork in Sri Lanka since the 1980s and has published widely on Sri Lanka in various journals, and two of his books are actually part of the reading list for students of society and culture in the Department of Social Studies. His more recent work examines the relationship between religion and politics. A new book, Checkpoint, Temple, Church and Mosque, written with colleagues from ZOAS, Zurich and Peradeniya on the work of religious organizations in war and peace in Sri Lanka, was released in 2014. Welcome to the lecture series for the digital library that's produced by the Department of Social Studies. So can I start with asking you, Professor Spencer, to tell us a little bit about what it was like in Sri Lanka when you started fieldwork in 1981, I think, and what kind of things did you find?
So I arrived in Sri Lanka in November 1981, and my memories of it are obviously highly coloured by everything that's happened since, so they're probably quite unreliable. But the strong sense I remember having was how nothing was like the books I'd read about it, and how little preparation reading, particularly the anthropology books, was for the world I encountered. So if you remember back to that time, that would be 1981 was the year when television started in Sri Lanka. It was a few months before the first international test match that Sri Lanka played at cricket. These things that we think of as like sort of absolutely standard part of everybody's life were completely brand new. There were brand new vehicles on the road. There was this new economic regime, the open economy had just started. And everything seemed very, very different from my expectations. And so to some extent, I guess what happened when I did my original research was I didn't exactly tear up what I'd proposed to do. I just forgot about it altogether. And I let the things that were happening in front of me begin to dictate the themes that emerged in the research. And that's, I guess, I'd like to think it was a principle I've followed ever since.
But how did you end up in that particular place that you did? Did you know beforehand, or was it chosen because of your particular interests, or how did that happen?
It was a very tortuous process finding somewhere to live and to actually base the research in. I realized that most of the other anthropologists I met went to places that somebody else knew. They went through personal connections and so on. And so, disobeying the first law of social life in Sri Lanka, I didn't go through personal connections. Probably lost several months of my life as a result. So I had a rough area that I was interested in, which was the area where I ended up, sort of around Balangoda and the eastern side of Sabaragamuwa. But even then, there were so many possible places I could go to, so many possible villages. And I had a piece of advice actually from Jock Stirrett, a senior figure to me at the time, who had said, look, don't worry too much about exactly where you go. Go somewhere where you feel comfortable, and things will follow from that. But don't put yourself in a place where you actually don't really feel like you could be at home. And I guess that's actually what I did. And he was right, and things did happen. And
what was it like? How long were you doing your initial period of fieldwork?
I was in Sri Lanka for just under 2 years, but I lived in the village for more like 18, 19 months. I left in the November of 1983. And first it was very difficult. I had pretty limited Sinhala. My Sinhala improved a lot very quickly from just living in this place where nobody else, or hardly anybody else, spoke English. But a limited singular, so that meant there were limited things you could do as a researcher. You couldn't ask those sophisticated questions you'd always imagined yourself asking when you'd got the vocabulary of a 5-year-old. But you could ask fairly simple ones, like how many people live in this house. So I did a household survey, got to know a lot of people. And then as my singular improved, things started to happen, and particularly in the second half of that year, that was when you had the first presidential election. Jayawarna was re-elected, which transformed everything that was going on. Then you had the very controversial referendum to extend the life of Parliament, further transformation of everything that was going on. And then you had a period after that, that was the end of 1982 by now. The first half of 1983, there was a sort of strange period all over the island with people sense that something not good was cooking up. And this was before the violence of July 1983, which didn't exactly coincide with the end of my field work, but it was towards the final part of it.
And then I think your book, A Sinhala Village in a Time of Trouble, examines particularly some of those questions that you just discussed, the kind of changes that were going on. And you describe in that book your own struggles to kind of explain how specifically the events of 1983 from the perspective of the village that you lived in, which for all intents and purposes was this very sort of peaceful place where there were no conflicts. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, when the violence broke out in July 83, like everybody else, I was extremely troubled by it. And actually, again, it was a friend of mine who gave me the advice. There was a curfew. It was very hard to get anywhere. I was in the village, had a motorbike, but I didn't have any petrol. At first I thought I must rush to somewhere where things are happening to find out what's going on. But I did manage to get through eventually to a friend of mine in Colombo on the phone who said, actually, it'd be much more valuable for people later on to know just what it did look like from this average place a long way away from the action. And that was good advice, rather than pursuing the headlines, as it were, but just concentrating on the kind of everyday perceptions of it. And of course, I mean, in that very particular week, what I learned about was the power, for example, the power of rumour, that the versions of the events that the people in the village were passing on from one to another, because there's almost no kind of credible news coming out at the time, they were radically different from what I was getting from, say, the BBC World Service or other international things that I could pick up on my radio.
So how were they getting this information? Was it radio?
Word of mouth. Word of mouth. Somebody's cousin had been in Colombo, somebody's brother-in-law had come up, so they'd heard this, they'd heard that. And so these were all these stories about how the LTT were attacking Colombo and how... and also it was also the version in which most of the, they'd say so many people have been killed, and I was very shocked one day when one of my neighbours said that, assumed that these were all Sinhala people have been killed, and that no Tamil people have been killed at all, which was again completely at variance with what we know was actually happening at the time. But these were things that people believed, and then afterwards, talking to other people who've been placed in other parts of the island, we realised that these rumours had played a very important part in shaping the violence. You then start to look at the other writings on collective violence, where you discover the power of rumour and the way in which certain kinds of cultural stereotypes and certain kinds of political narratives take shape within them. And it's not the explanation for what happened, but it does explain a lot of the particularities of what happened once the actual violence itself had started.
In your book, you mentioned the fact that even though, that there was a lot of talk about the nation, nationalism, what it meant to be Sinhala and all of this. I think you talk about the school principal, the school teacher in particular, who's a central figure in I think told you first off as soon as you came what kind of people the Sinhala were and all of that. Did that begin to make sense to you after what happened in 1983? How did you?
Well, it made. I wouldn't put the two things quite so closely together. Be a bit careful about that. What what it meant to me, or the interpretation I took away from it, and I sort of went back over this again and again afterwards. One thing was that this was a village which had, in a space of a generation, it had acquired, connections with the outside world it hadn't had before. It had a road, it had a school, it had a temple. They hadn't had any of those things. And the very old people had a sense, looking back, that they weren't really proper Sinhala Buddhist people in those days. And it was only with the arrival of the Pantsala and the arrival of the school that they'd learnt how to be proper Sinhala Buddhist people. So to some extent what I watched was a very kind of peripheral group of people being inducted into this singular story of the Sinhala Buddhist nation and Sinhala nationalism. The other thing was the fact that you heard so much about this all the time. It raised for me the fairly obvious question: if this is such a taken for granted part of people's sense of who they are and where they've come from, why do we keep having to talk about it all the time? Why does it need this constant reiteration? And then that suggested there was something a bit more fragile there. That this wasn't quite as stable or as strong as other representations suggested. So it provoked a kind of historicising of the assumptions that had been made up till then about Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, which became part of, again, I think like a lot of these things, it's important to remember that I wasn't thinking about this on my own. I was talking to other researchers in Sri Lanka at the time, and then other people back in the UK, people in the United States. And so we were, comparing notes and passing around drafts. And so very, very quickly, new kinds of questions emerged. And so just to go back to the fieldwork, what I have ended up doing was kind of retrospectively looking at all the things that had happened in the fieldwork in the light of these new questions. But the fieldwork wasn't conducted with those questions. Right up until, well, actually I came back to the UK in late '83. I didn't think I was writing about nationalism, for example, because I thought that's not something you write about from a village.
But then it features quite a bit,
that's right,
ultimately, in your book. Okay, just to shift a little bit, I think perhaps the 1980s saw the kind of shift in anthropology of Sri Lanka also, where there was a sort of surge of interest in violence and explaining violence. And many of these explanations kind of try to provide sort of cultural explanations of violence, most controversially the work of Bruce Kapferer. You yourself have been a strong critique of Kapferer's work, but there are other scholars like Pradeep Jagannathan who've also been very scathing about these kinds of explanations. What are your views on this?
Yeah, what happened in '83, '84 was, I think, a number of both local scholars who, actually, to be fair, scholars associated with groups like Social Scientists Association were already raising these questions before the violence of July '83. And non-Sri Lankan scholars who were working on the island, it became a kind of pressing concern, regardless of discipline or what topic people were like, how has this happened? Where has it come from? And very similar things happened in India after the anti-Sikh violence of 1984, and even more after the Ayodhya violence in 1992. So there was a sense of, there was a kind of responsibility to try and contribute to making some sense of this. So there was a sort of some swerve, as it were, of intellectual direction, and that part. So that happened very, very specifically in the second half of the 1980s, and there were no real. There were models in social history for talking about this sort of thing, and political sociology. There weren't really models in anthropology. Certainly not in Sri Lanka. And there was almost nothing written about violence in Sri Lanka before the '83 riots. So again, it's important to mention. And then people tried to come up with various sorts of explanations. And so my friends Chuck Stewart and Liz Nissen wrote a very long working paper which combined kind of historical analysis of the construction of singular identity, and that's the stuff that people know now that was published in the book I edited on Sri Lanka. But there was a second half to it, which was all about exorcisms and the kind of cultural logic of the violence, which they never published. They took that out and they never published it. But a version of, or a very similar kind of argument then came out about a year later from Bruce Kapferer, apparently independently. And I found it very troubling in lots of ways, not least because it didn't seem to have any empirical resonance with anything I knew about what had happened. It didn't talk about the political causes of the violence, whereas I think it's now widely accepted that, you know, people associated with the then ruling party were very heavily involved in actually creating the circumstances of the violence, and that seemed to be a terribly important thing to mention. But also it had an argument about violence in everyday life, which was, well, there were a lot of claims about that. There wasn't any specific examples, which again made absolutely no sense to me in terms of my understanding of everyday life living in this village, where you basically did not see a lot of violence or conflict. You did see it occasionally, but it was very, very sporadic. So I wrote a critique of the book, thinking, well, you know, I don't think I'm a great authority on this topic, because it wasn't what I was doing my research on, but if I just scoop together all the evidence I can get from what other people have written at other times, however good or bad it is, and put it all into one place, plus everything we think we know about the 83 violence, and just work out what are the factors at work here. So that was my one kind of contribution. And it was ironic, to put it mildly, that Pradeep Jagannathan should actually bundle it up with Kapferer as an example of the same stuff, basically, when the only reason I'd written it in the first place was because I was kind of really, really quite cross and quite appalled by the quality of Kapferer's argument, but also by what I took to be the political implications, because if you make an argument that can be read as, he denies that this is what it is, but it can be read as singular people are inherently violent, or, you know, singular nationalism is inherently always going to be like this, you are colluding in a version of the world which is really, really, really problematic. And I think all along the spirit of the critical work we were trying to do was to say there are other ways of looking at this. Let's just expand the possible ways that we can interpret this. So there is there's a cultural bit in that article I wrote, but it's by no means the only bit at all. And you know, as I've gone back over that material, more and more I've chosen to highlight the political circumstances of the 83 violence. You know, when a government, as I've said before, declared war on its own people, or a section of its own people, because that seemed to me to be the one thing that we need to agree on and to think about.
But it's interesting. I mean, 1983 was not the first time Sri Lanka's experienced ethnic violence. There was in the 1950s, and soon after the UNP came into power in 1977. So, but the sort of scholarly interest is more or less on 1983. Can you think of why? That is?
Well, I don't think it's just the scholarly interest, because 83, you know, you can also look at it in terms of the long history of the war, and you can say, well, after 83, there were other times when not terrible, but huge numbers of people got killed in other kinds of circumstances. There are other sorts of atrocities. Why do we always go back to this one? But it's one that I think it goes way beyond kind of academic argument. It's perceived as a watershed moment. It has that kind of position in, if you like, the popular history of what happened, whether it's whichever side of the conflict it's told from, it's there. And to be fair to the people who did try to write about it, I mean, one of the first things that we did was to go back to writing about the 58 violence by, say, Tazi Vitachi, or the local reports that have been done on the 1981 violence in Jaffna, or the violence after the Sansoni Commission report after the 77 election. And this is again, to go back to the rumour question, one of the interesting things is discovering, of course, that similar rumours pop up in these very different circumstances. So there's a sort of subterranean level of rumour ready to be spread, which just keeps coming out about babies getting thrown into wells and these sorts of things. And then you discover that the same rumours are spread on both sides of the violence, but with different people responsible for what's happened, and so on. So actually going back to look at the historical records, Jock Stirrat went back looking at anti-Catholic or Catholic Buddhist riots in the 19th century in the archives at that time. So there were attempts to put it into a bigger perspective, understanding about things. And then of course you realise that anti-Tamil violence as such is a relatively new thing, that the colonial stuff it's all about different religious groups. It's not about what we now call ethnic groups. And that again disturbs the kind of history that would see this particular antagonism as always the same and always in place.
Another aspect of your work has been this, and I think again you touch on it in both Sinhala Village in Time of Trouble and your other later work, that somehow politics is something that is seen as distasteful, something that is kind of left to rather sort of dubious politicians, and that normal people do not do politics. But it's something that is very much a part of how people engage with each other. How do you explain this? I mean, you talk about it extensively even in this book, but can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first answer is ethnographic. Is that I'm sitting in this village, which frankly is about as interesting as villages are in August in Sri Lanka, which is not ever so interesting a lot of the time. Not a lot goes on, and then suddenly there's the word there's going to be an election, and things start happening. Fights break out. Rumours are circulating. Everyone gets extremely agitated, and people even start apologising to me for the moral condition of the place. That it'll be okay once this is over. But also, everyone, it's not just that these disturbing or troublesome things are going on. Everyone's kind of enjoying it as well. So it's not just a bad thing. It's also something that people are quite sort of fascinated by. And but they're at pains to point out this is different from normal everyday stuff. And it's not stuff we do. It's always the other people who do it, who cause the trouble. And so that was, in the book, that became one of the big sort of structuring things, the contrast between the rhythms of normal life, which were dominated by stuff happening at the peninsula or the rhythm of agricultural work, and this kind of, in Shakespearean terms, time out of joint, the time of trouble of the title, when the politics would be going on. And the perception of politics is basically bad news. It's a source of trouble and a source of moral disorder. It's not confined to Sri Lanka. I mean, you find it everywhere in the world. Politicians are nobody's favourite people. But you do get a particularly pronounced version of it, not just here, but across South Asia too. So other people writing about villages in India would come out with very, very similar reports. And so an idea, I suppose the next 20 years of my life was spent trying to kind of come up with an intellectual account of this, an account which is very, very different from the political theorist's normal account, which stresses, the deliberative processes of democracy, whereas here you've got democracy basically as one big fight, where you pick sides and you just go for it. And I mean, I did eventually get somewhere with that, although even now I feel it's a bit provisional. But I did 20 years after I first got bothered about it, I felt I'd worried about it enough and moved on.
But this is something that I heard someone else, not an anthropologist, say that we now live in a post-political world. And I couldn't quite understand what that meant. And she was referring again to this sort of reluctance of people to be engaged politically. What do you think of this term that we are now living in a post-political world?
It slightly stretches my credibility. I see people who might want to, but the recent events here would seem to suggest completely otherwise. And also they I don't know about turning on the head, but they certainly would cause me to reformulate quite a lot of what I've said before, because this last election was one being fought about the return of, if you like, virtue to the political for people, that something that seemed to unite people across a very broad and in other respects very dissonant political spectrum was the need to bring a bit of virtue back into proceedings, and of course that's not in the script that I'd written at all. I'd thought that generally people said this is beyond redemption. So the question in that case was, well, why do people continue to participate? And there seems to be something about the participation in voting in particular, which is seen as a civic and virtuous act by people. And I think that was true back then, and it's still true now. For everything else that's gone on, everything else that goes around, there is still something terribly important about having that say in things that brings a sort of order back into this very, very unruly world.
But I think what's happening in the current situation is also this sense that you can't leave politics to the politicians, that people have to get involved. So similarly, like in 1994, when there was a lot of civil society engagement behind the elections, then questions that are being asked now is, okay, we failed in 1994 because civil society then stepped back and let the politicians deal with it, whereas this time you can't do that. You have to continue to be engaged, and I find that a really interesting idea as well of what politics means now and who should be doing politics.
We shall wait and see.
We shall wait and see, indeed. So, okay, now shift again to, if you look around the work that is being done, perhaps in the last 2-3 years, there seems to be a kind of an interest in topics that are not about ethnicity and violence, which has sort of dominated Sri Lankan scholarly work for so long. And your own work seems to reflect some of that shift. Now, I mean, you're working on religion, you're working on conversions, youth, urbanization. How do you see this shift, and what made you move into these areas?
Well, there's been two moves. One was the move to do this big project in the East, with Muslims and Tamils and Sinhala Buddhists and Christians and so on, about the role of religion in the conflict. So one bit of that was a continuation of this kind of rather obsessive concern with the conflict, but actually doing it from the East and doing it from the point of view of religion created sort of a very, very different perspective on things that were going on. At least I think it did. And also doing it in a way where the research was not pre-structured in terms of ethnicity. That is to say, it wasn't about conflict and Buddhists or about conflict and Muslims. It was about all these groups together and their interactions and what emerges from that. In other words, seeing the intellectual object as a group of people who have social relations with each other, not a group of people who live in sealed bubbles called ethnic groups. Because the island is a place where people have relations with each other. So that was the first bit, but as that was going on, also, and the war was winding down, it did become apparent just how much the intellectual agenda had been overset by the conflict. And so much had happened in the country that we just didn't know about. You know, the working through of the social consequences of the post-77 economic reforms, the emergence of a new middle class, the emergence of new consumption patterns. I mean, what did this mean for classic topics like families and marriage and so on? And people simply hadn't been documenting that in the same way. So quite apart from the groups of people who hadn't been written about as well, which one could list for quite some time. So it's not like there are things that must happen or a new agenda. There are actually so many things that have been neglected.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of those also is the attempt to kind of put the fragments together into a bigger picture about what's been going on in the society, which kind of bothers me. That you get these little snapshots of particular places, or you get very sweeping generalizations, which aren't really based on research. They're based on, traveling around in your air-conditioned vehicle and, maybe talking to the odd three-wheeler driver. But you don't have research-based stuff that looks at the social consequences of the open economy, for example, or there's very little that does that. And so, there's loads of things to find out about.
But your friend, the late Newton Gunasinghe, tried to do that a little bit in 1983 to provide a sort of a different lens with which to look at violence, but nobody seems to have kind of picked up on that. Till quite recently, there seems to be now a interest again.
There's been a bit on it. I mean, I gave a lecture in Colombo a few years ago, which was deliberately critical of the specific arguments that Newton Gunasinghe made about the links to between the open economy and violence, and reminded the audience of another very important paper of his written at the same time about how the left couldn't come to terms with the power of ethnicity as a mobilizing force, that they always had to kind of come up with an economic explanation to make it seem the kind of politics they could handle. And so I think one of the problems with Newton's specific arguments on the open economies is provided people with an excuse to say, oh, actually the reason why all this happened was the IMF or the World Bank or some bad external agency, rather than actually this is stuff that's happened here for reasons to do with here. For me, for reasons to do with the political order here more than anything else. But nevertheless, the looking at the economic changes and trying to get the bigger sense of that, which is something that Newton was very concerned with. There are people beginning to return to these themes, but there's a tiny handful of them as far as I know, and there's a huge amount of work to do. The countryside, which in the 70s and 80s was very well documented, because that's where you went to do research. Since then it's been neglected in policy terms, it's been neglected economically, and it's been neglected intellectually. And so we know very, very little about what it's like to live in a village now. We probably knew too much in the 80s, certainly enough, but now we don't have that kind of material for the last 20 odd years.
To return to your more recent work and the book that's just come out, Checkpoint, Temple, Church and Mosque, which is going to be launched very soon in Sri Lanka as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and also about the collaborative work that you seem to be doing more and more now?
Yeah, in fact, I think I only really do collaborative work now, except things like marking essays and other mundane activities. And even that I try to make collaborative. I had a period when I was very involved in administration in Edinburgh, running the Graduate School of Social Science, and I was on all sorts of big national committees. And so what happens at that point in your career is you get further and further away from your own research and having interesting things to talk about. And then I realised, and if you keep at it long enough and you're terribly ambitious, you could be a vice chancellor or something like that. I met a few vice chancellors, and I thought this is not a happy place to be. I'm sure it's different here.
Very different.
But this wasn't why I got involved in academic life at all. So I thought I really need to kind of get out of this. But I also realised that it'd been a long time since I'd done fresh new fieldwork of any sort. But what I had done a lot of when I was doing this administrative stuff was I had done a lot of actually collaborative stuff. I put teams of people together for different tasks, including some research as well that we did on social science in the UK with different groups of people. And I really liked putting the teams together, getting kind of combinations of people who could do different things which complemented each other. And you can find out so much so fast if you get the right people. And so I came back here in 2005 looking for collaborations and I found wonderful partners in Tudor Silva, who's a very old friend of mine, but who I hadn't seen for a long time, and Shaul Hezbollah from Peradeniya, who was a new friend of mine, but who was already working closely with Tudor. And they were very committed to trying to build this inter-university arrangement with Peradeniya, Eastern and Southeastern University out in the east. And I thought this is exactly the sort of project I want to be involved in. And so we had a group of people and we needed a project, and a research program came along looking for projects on conflict and on religion. And I thought, well, Sri Lanka has no shortage of both of these. Let's have a go. And we accumulated rather more partners as we went along. We had quite a lot of partners. There were 6 of us involved in the project. And we were working in different languages, different points around Bataklo, Ampara, Akrapatu in the east, different religious communities, comparing notes, putting it all together. And it was great. It was just a wonderful, liberating experience. Writing the book was rather hard work, because it's a book which ostensibly has 6 co-authors. It's not an edited book, so it has a single voice running through it. Some of the time sounds a bit like my voice, but not all of the time. But actually getting that material together and getting a single story out, that was, and of course everybody was very busy as well. We'd all moved on to other things. So there was a long time of getting the book done. But it's done now, and I would love it if other people saw it as something to be, either as something to emulate, in other words, put together other teams to do other kinds of projects which allow you to get a bigger picture, or disagree violently with something in it and go out and find out a better version of it, because all the topics in it are topics deserving of much more research than we were able to give them in that context. And it's just rich, fascinating topic.
Can you tell us a little bit about what is in the book? Because we're all waiting very eagerly to get our hands on it.
Well, the big story that we went out with a grant to look at the role of religious organizations in the conflict, and we assumed it would be like religious NGOs or something like that, Islamic relief. And this was, of course, immediately after the tsunami too, so there'd been World Vision, and the East Coast in particular, there were huge four-wheel drive vehicles with radio masts clogging up the roads, flying the flags of all these different NGOs, many of which had religious attachments back where they came from. But actually, by the time we got going on the fieldwork, the NGOs were moving out on the whole. And the first stories we started to pick up very, very early, and very striking stories, were to do with, I remember one of the first ones told by a colleague at Eastern University, the much missed late Khalil Haq, telling us about how the year before we got there, there'd been a grenade attack in the mosque in Akrapatu. And this was obviously a provocation from one or other armed group, a provocation probably intended to get the Muslim community to attack Tamil targets in the neighborhood. But the Mosque Federation leaders had got together, they'd broadcast appeals for calm over the mosque loudspeakers, they'd sent groups of men out onto the edges of town to stop young men going out looking for trouble. They'd basically put the lid on the situation, and they'd also found leaders from other religious communities, particularly Catholic priests, that they could talk to kind of settle the situation. It's a really interesting story. And we discovered that things like this had been happening, actually probably throughout the war, but certainly in that period been happening a lot, that certain kinds of local religious leaders had become very important mediators of local conflict in what we call flashpoint situations, like the one where somebody is trying to stage a provocation. But then we discover other things. We discover that the same leaders might, in other contexts, be the people who actually create the flashpoints, that the people who are most involved in the mediation work are also most concerned with, protecting the boundaries of their own religious communities. Catholic priests, again, very obviously. We've discovered that the Muslim reaction to the war in the East had taken actually 2 new organisational forms, one of which is well known. It's the creation of the Sri Lanka Muslim Congress, a Muslim political party for the first time. But at the same time, there'd been the creation of these mosque federations, which, and this goes back to the earlier conversation, deliberately kept themselves sort of at arm's length from the politicians. And whereas the SLMC had kind of fragmented over the years and had become another group of politicians, the mosque federations had endured and played quite an important role in local social organisation. So this was a kind of using the structure of the mosques as the platform to create what you could call a religious civil society. So all that was happening. Meanwhile, the other stuff you think about in the religion of the conflict, which is people going to religious healers, people who've lost relatives going to somebody who can consult an oracle, get possessed. That stuff was also there. We did much less documentation of that. It was the nature of the research we did. It's much weaker. We relied much more on other people's work on that thing. But a very obvious aspect of the healing part of the religious response to the war is that's where the boundaries melt away. That's where Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, people just go wherever they go. But the people involved in that healing do not come forward as public leaders in the same way as the Catholic priests or the mosque. So there's a trade-off there. And boundaries have different roles at the different bits. So there's a lot more in the book than that. And as I said, everything is sort of provisional in the sense that there's so much more that you could say about any one of the topics. But it was really exciting stuff. I mean, I'd like to think we found out something people didn't know about, and we think that people ought to know about. And it's also about how people endured the years of war, how they used resources like this as a means to hold their communities together.
I'd like to maybe ask you a little bit about, you use the term religious civil society. I think that's interesting in that generally when we think of civil society, you have a particular view of it. And then in Sri Lanka, civil society became so sort of closely linked to NGOs. And yet now, more recently, you've seen that kind of thing, not only in the East, the emergence of Bodu Bala Sena and all of this, where there's a sort of a normative sense of civil society being good, whereas that, if you consider what has been happening with Bodu Bala Sena and similar groups, you can hardly sort of say that that's good for society. But then, where do you position those groups and their potential for violence and all of this? We use the term religious civil society once or twice in the book itself, but with some nervousness, I think. You're thinking this is the sort of thing you can see it catching on and becoming the buzzword for about 3 months in all these agency reports and policy documents, and then disappearing again. And I suppose one of the things reasons for concern is the normative issue with writing about civil society. The organisations we talked about, we didn't want to sort of just present them as straightforwardly good things in kind of comfortable liberal terms, because I think that's not what they are, and that's not really what they're about. There is potential for some of that, but there's also potential for the BBS type phenomena emerging as well. It's about self-organisation, and it's about the project we were working on was called, the bigger program was called Non-Governmental Public Action, and it was being set up by people in development studies predominantly who are interested in civil society, who are interested in NGOs, but wanted to move beyond that narrow sense of things to see what else was there. So it was actually a great kind of context in which to be working, because we had a lot of encouragement to say, well, let's take these sorts of actors seriously as well.
for good or bad.
Yeah.
And you get then other things happen. So as well as the mosque federations in the East, you've also got tons of internal religious divisions in the Muslim community, which could be seen as part of a very kind of cantankerous version of religious civil society if you wanted to. And potentially actually quite troubled and violent. Or, this is Muslim against Muslim antagonism, and which had become more visible with the decline in the threat from the LTTE. I think, not surprisingly, perhaps, but that was also there in the mix. And people who can be fantastically liberal in terms of their attitude to other communities in one context can be very illiberal in other contexts. So I think it's again, this is not something that we talk about in the book in particular, but I think looking at recent events, I think there's a great danger in seizing on a particular moment and saying that shows what this kind of people are really like, or this is what people really think. So somebody who in the height of the trouble around Buddha Balasena, somebody who might have been coming out with quite aggressive views about Muslims, you might talk to them today and they might not be saying anything of the sort. They might even have forgotten it. I think we have to remember these things come and go, and there are potentialities in any social situation which get heightened particularly again by political contexts.
But I think in some ways it also poses a challenge to liberal civil society in the way in which civil society has positioned itself or seen itself, and then its reaction to these kinds of groups also. So
and we I think in our early presentations at the end of the report, but I think slightly toned down in the book, we were quite provocative in what we said, for example, about NGOs, that reflected what people themselves said. Because we'd say, who would you trust in this situation? An NGO, head of an NGO, or a priest? And they say, well, trust the priest, of course. Goes without saying. But also, in the words of a friend of mine from Bataclan, there was a kind of tiredness with what she called the projectification of everything, the way in which the institutional apparatus of the non-governmental, particularly again with the tsunami, had fitted all kinds of activity into these kind of like pre-packaged projects with logical frameworks and everything, and the need to actually find other ways of engaging people in public action. But this is not something that we've particularly worked through in the book, but it's very interesting stuff to think about.
Clearly work that needs to be done. Okay, so we're sort of in the Department of Social Studies just beginning to introduce subjects like political anthropology and get students interested in that kind of work. And so what would you have to say about what anthropology of politics could look like in Sri Lanka, and what directions might it take given all these changes that have taken place?
Well, one of my problems throughout my career has been the fact that I do find most political anthropology extraordinarily boring. Like it was the cupboard they put boring anthropologists into, because it was the place where you did a certain kind of analysis, which tended to be hard-nosed, not particularly kind of cultural, and it was all about people strategizing and that kind of thing. And actually, versions of that have come back, under more theoretically radical appearance, but nevertheless just as sort of dull and predictable. So I think one of the really important thing about understanding, using anthropology to understand things that people call politics or the political, is to bring back the sense of uncertainty and surprise. And this is a wonderful moment in which to say that, because I'm still extremely surprised by everything that's happened in the last couple of months. So bring back the element of surprise. When I talked about the village, I said, how there was, there's fun there as well. Going to a big political rally is, actually quite good fun, as if you don't get beaten up or blown up or attacked by somebody. But it has an entertainment component. Gossiping about politicians has a big entertainment component. So we need to, reintroduce those. The fact that it's not simply about strategizing and stuff like that. All these other areas of life get kind of pulled into it. And also that it's scary and dangerous at times. And this worries people. And also that people make big efforts to step outside of it. This again is one of the big themes in the new book, is how people use the label religion as a way to kind of, even people who are actually deeply involved in politics say, oh, I'm not doing politics, I'm just a vicar, I'm just this, I'm just that, I'm just the Mosque Federation secretary, just happen to also be a provincial councillor or something, but let's not talk about that. So to do certain things you have to step out of politics, and that's a really interesting, or pretend to step out of it in order to bring the people in the village together, or people in the town together, or to act against this or to act against that.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a slightly, maybe perhaps odd question, and that is, there's been, particularly in the last few months, this sort of real interest in linking astrology with politics. And what I find particularly intriguing about it is that this similar kind of conversations or debates took place during the time of President Premadasa. And it's very tempting to kind of make a link. But what is your view on this? Is this something that is very unique to Sri Lankan politics, this interest or intrigue around astrology, or is it something that you find in South Asia, Southeast Asia as well?
You certainly find it in India. And the how would one put it, the kind of the occult properties of the political, the way in which politicians use all kinds of apparently supernatural equipment as part of their politics. By no means unique to Sri Lanka, it goes without saying. But I certainly had a lot of flashbacks to the late President Premadasa in his days, particularly around things like the Grease Devil, the Grease Yakko, back in 2011, where the ways in which the stories around that were circulating were very, very like the stories that were circulating in 1991, 92, in the last years of Premadasa's presidency. And I think, you can now look back and say, well, of course it would, because, 2 years on from 1991, 92, you had this change of government and a moment of optimism and so on. And so that was the last days of what can now be seen to be a dying regime. And you can say, perhaps, that's what was also happening in 2011, 12, 13. Again, it was the same thing, a kind of moment before a major transition. But I think that might be a little bit too glib. I think there might be other. I think there are differences as well as similarities, and we need to realise that. And this latest transition is a different transition from 1994. Not least because 1994 was a world still, in the end, dominated by the war with the LTTE, and that's not a factor. So that's means we really don't know what's going to happen next. And that, again, I guess is the point.
Exactly. So thank you very much for a very interesting conversation about your work and what the future of anthropology could look like in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much. It's been a real privilege having you with us, and we look forward to welcoming you back at some point.
Thank you for your questions.